In the most luxurious chamber of Topkapi Palace, a 25-year-old prince clutches the golden bars of his cage. His name is Prince Mustafa. Outside, he watches free people, gardeners, guards, concubines. They walk freely, laugh, live. But he knows he can never leave. This cage is made of gold, furnished with the finest silks. The most delicious foods are served. The most beautiful concubines attend to him. But this paradise is actually the most sophisticated hell, because there are only two ways out of this cage: the throne or the grave. And princes usually choose the grave. When Mustafa entered this cage at 15, he was strong, intelligent, full of life. Now at 25, his hair has turned prematurely gray. The light of life has faded from his eyes. And he knows this: if his brother, the Sultan, dies, he will either ascend to the throne or have his neck severed. There is no third option. As you watch this video, you'll learn about the Ottoman Empire's horrific system that lasted 400 years. The cage system drove hundreds of princes to madness, killed them, and rotted the great empire from within. If you're curious about history's dark secrets, this story will deeply affect you. Don't forget to hit that like button and tell us in the comments which country you're watching from. Now, prepare to witness Mustafa's final days. The conquest of Istanbul in 1453 was a great victory for the Ottoman Empire, but it was also the beginning of a great problem. As the empire grew, succession wars intensified. Every time a sultan died, princes would fight each other, dragging the country into civil war. Mehmed the Conqueror was aware of this problem. He had witnessed the succession struggles during his father Murad II's time. He remembered periods when princes fought each other and the country was torn apart, and he made a terrible decision: princes would no longer live freely. Initially, the system wasn't so harsh. Princes lived in mansions near the palace, in controlled freedom. But as years passed, restrictions increased. In the 16th century, during Suleiman the Magnificent's reign, the system became even harsher. The cage system was based on simple logic. If princes were kept in the palace, under control, they couldn't rebel. Succession wars would be prevented. The country would achieve stability. But this system had a horrific price: the mental health of princes. The cage system wasn't just a physical prison. It was also psychological torture. Princes, from birth to death, could never be free. They could never experience real life. And worst of all, they knew they could be killed at any moment. Prince Mustafa's day begins the same way every morning. After morning prayers, he looks out from the same room, the same window. He watches people living outside, envying their freedom. The daily routine of princes living in the cage system was very boring and repetitive. They would wake up, pray, have breakfast. Then they would spend the day with activities like reading books, calligraphy, listening to music. But none of these had any real purpose. They were just meant to pass time. The most painful part was having their connections to the outside world completely severed. Princes couldn't meet with the people, couldn't see real problems. They couldn't develop administrative skills. They couldn't gain military experience. So if they ever ascended to the throne, they would start as complete amateurs. The biggest problem for princes living in cages was loneliness. They could have limited meetings even with family members. Their mothers could visit them, but meetings with their fathers were very rare. Because sultans were careful not to form emotional bonds with their princes, this emotional bond could make it difficult to decide to kill them if necessary. Concubines and servants were the only human contact for princes living in cages. But these relationships were also very superficial. Concubines and servants were constantly changed because they weren't wanted to form close relationships with princes. The psychological effects of the cage system on princes were severe. Living in closed spaces for long years, social isolation, constant fear of death, All of these damaged the mental health of princes. Prince Mustafa had recently begun exhibiting strange behaviors. He would stay awake at nights, talking to imaginary people. Sometimes he would stand at the window for hours trying to imitate the birds outside, as if he wanted to fly away like them. Many princes gradually lost their connection to reality. Some imagined themselves as great emperors, commanding phantom armies. Others felt completely worthless and turned to suicide. One of the most horrific aspects of the cage system was waiting syndrome. Princes never knew when they would ascend to the throne or when they would be killed. This uncertainty kept them in constant tension. Every time a door opened, their hearts would race, wondering, is this the time? Some princes couldn't endure the psychological pressure and killed themselves, because living with uncertainty was even harder than certain death. At least death would end everything. The cage system affected not only princes but also their mothers deeply. In the Ottoman palace, mothers lived in constant anxiety about their children's future. When Prince Mustafa's mother, Gulshah Hatun, went to see her son, she felt her heart breaking. Her son, who was once cheerful and energetic, now seemed like a ghost. Even as conversations had begun to become meaningless, mothers had to watch their children rot in cages. They had no power to save them, because the cage system was state policy and no one could oppose it. Some mothers devised crazy plans to save their children, kidnapping from the palace, secretly achieving freedom. But these plans always ended in failure, and the result was even harsher punishments. The most painful part was mothers watching their children go insane. Their sons, who were once intelligent and talented, were gradually losing their minds, and mothers could do nothing to stop this process. Gulshah Hatun's greatest fear was that her son would completely lose his mind, because princes who went mad in cages were usually considered dangerous and killed. So the cage system first drove princes insane, then killed them using this madness as an excuse. Sultans were also not happy with this system. They often had to cage their own brothers and sons. This situation troubled their consciences too. The current sultan was Prince Mustafa's older brother. They had played together as children, learned from the same teachers. But when he ascended to the throne, he had to cage his brother, because if he set him free, there was a risk of rebellion. This sultan couldn't sleep peacefully at night. Knowing that his brother was rotting in a cage disturbed him. But state interest was more important than personal feelings. Some sultans couldn't bear this psychological burden and preferred to kill their brothers immediately. At least this way, the long torture would end. But this didn't ease their consciences either. The cage system wore down not only princes, but also sultans psychologically, because oppressing one's own family was never easy for anyone. One of the most harmful effects of the cage system was the inadequate education of princes. Normally, princes would receive education in administration, military strategy, diplomacy from childhood. But princes living in cages couldn't gain these experiences. Prince Mustafa was a very intelligent young man. He wrote poetry, made music, was interested in mathematics and astronomy, but he had never gained any real-life experience. He had never gone to war, never spoken with the people, never done any administration. This situation would cause very big problems if he ever ascended to the throne. Princes who left cages and became sultan directly made bad decisions due to their inexperience. Throughout history, there were many princes who left cages and became sultan. Most of these sultans made big mistakes in their first years because they had theoretical knowledge but no practical experience. The princes in the worst condition were those who stayed in cages for so long that when they ascended to the throne, they were completely maladjusted. They had even forgotten palace protocols. They didn't know how to speak with the people. Some princes tried to rebel against the cage system, but these attempts usually ended in failure. Prince Mustafa was also making escape plans recently. At night, he secretly talked with concubines, researching ways to escape from the palace. But he knew that if he was caught, he would be killed immediately. One of the most famous escape attempts occurred in the 17th century. A prince had managed to get out of his cage by bribing one of the guards, but he was caught outside the palace and immediately executed. Escape attempts usually ended with betrayal, because everyone in the palace watched each other. Even the concubines and servants next to princes could be informants. Failed escape attempts made the cage system even harsher. Princes' movement areas were further restricted, surveillance was increased. Prince Mustafa's 10 years in the cage were coming to an end. His brother, the Sultan, was ill and could die soon. In this case, either Mustafa would ascend to the throne, or he would be killed on the grounds of being dangerous. In recent days, Mustafa's behavior had become even stranger. He was constantly talking to himself, fighting imaginary enemies. The cage system had succeeded in driving him mad. His mother, Gulsha Atun, was very upset when she saw her son's condition. Her son, who was once very talented, had now lost his connection to reality. Mustafa's greatest fear was leaving the cage and becoming sultan, because he knew that after living in a cage for 10 years, he could never be a good sultan. He had no experience, didn't know the people, was unaware of the country's problems. At the same time, continuing to stay in the cage was unbearable, because he was going more insane with each passing day. The cage system was slowly killing him. The cage system affected not only princes, but the entire Ottoman Empire negatively, because sultans who ascended to the throne were inexperienced and psychologically troubled. One of the important reasons for the Ottoman Empire's weakening in the 17th and 18th centuries was the cage system. Sultans who came out of cages were not capable of governing the country. In Europe, princes lived freely, gained experience, and were raised as strong leaders. But Ottoman princes rotted in cages. This situation gradually widened the gap between the two civilizations. One of the worst examples was sultans, who were completely raised in cages, being unable to connect with the real world at all. These sultans didn't understand the people's problems and made wrong decisions. The cage system also damaged the Ottoman dynasty's gene pool, because many princes died without having children. The dynasty weakened and its capacity to produce quality leaders decreased. In the autumn of 1839, Prince Mustafa's brother, the Sultan, died. Now, a decision had to be made. Mustafa would either ascend to the throne or be killed. When palace dignitaries gathered, they evaluated Mustafa's condition. After staying in a cage for 10 years, he was now in a state of madness. If he ascended to the throne, he could pose a danger to the country, but killing him wasn't easy either. Because he was a legitimate heir, his killing could be badly received by the people. Finally, a painful decision was made. Mustafa died of natural causes. Another victim of the cage system had been given. With Mustafa's death, the brutality of the cage system was once again revealed. Now some intellectuals began to say that this system was wrong. In the mid-19th century, the cage system gradually began to soften. Princes gained more freedom. But the damage the system had done could not be compensated. There are many historical documents and testimonies about the cage system. European diplomats, travelers, and Ottoman chroniclers recorded the horror of this system. Especially European diplomats who visited the Ottoman palace in the 18th century saw princes living in cages and were amazed by their conditions. According to their notes, princes were living almost like animals. A Venetian ambassador wrote about a prince he saw in a cage. This man could once have been a powerful commander, but the cage has completely finished him. He can't even remember his own name now. Ottoman chroniclers had also noticed the problems of this system, but they didn't dare criticize it openly. They only pointed to the system's wrongness in indirect ways. One of the most pitiful testimonies was the funeral ceremonies of princes who died in cages. Very few people attended these ceremonies because princes living in cages had completely separated from society. The cage system wasn't unique to the Ottoman Empire. There were similar practices in other civilizations too. but none was as systematic and long-lasting as the Ottoman one. In China during the Ming Dynasty, princes also lived restricted lives, but they could at least connect with the world outside the palace. In Europe, the opposite situation existed. Princes were sent to different countries from a very young age, gaining experience. This is why European kings were usually more successful. The biggest difference of the cage system was its completely isolating nature. Princes had no connection with the outside world. This situation had completely disconnected them from reality. In other cultures, princes could at least interact with the people. But Ottoman princes only knew the narrow circle inside the palace. From a modern psychology perspective, the cage system can be evaluated as a type of institutional abuse. Long-term isolation, uncertainty, fear of death. These cause severe psychological damage. Most princes living in cages developed learned helplessness syndrome. They no longer believed they could change their situations. Social isolation also dulled princes' ability to empathize because they didn't interact with different people. This situation, if they became sultan, led to their inability to understand the people's problems. The most harmful psychological effect was identity confusion. Princes didn't know who they were, what they wanted to become, because they had never had a chance to make choices. The trauma created by the cage system wasn't limited to just that generation. Sultans who had lived in cages couldn't approach their own children healthily either. When the Ottoman Empire began modernization efforts in the 19th century, the cage system also began to be questioned. Especially European advisors clearly stated the harm of this system. With the Tanzimat period, attempts were made to improve princes' education and living conditions. Now more freedom was granted, and they were enabled to connect with the outside world. But the damage of a system that lasted for centuries couldn't be immediately compensated. The dynasty had weakened, the capacity to produce quality leaders had been lost. Late Ottoman princes were people who were educated in Europe and had modern ideas. But it was too late. The empire had entered a process of collapse. The end of the cage system was an important part of the Ottoman Empire's modernization efforts. But unfortunately, this was too late. The cage system isn't just a practice that remained in the past. We encounter similar situations today too. Overprotective families can cause damage similar to the cage system. Children can't gain real-life experience, can't develop independence. The isolation of opposition leaders in dictatorships also resembles the cage system. People are kept in closed areas, trying to damage their mental health. Cage system-like practices can also be seen in modern workplaces. Employees are forced to live in closed environments with minimal social interaction. The most important lesson is this: depriving humans of their freedom doesn't just solve the current problem. It creates much bigger problems in the long run. And so, Prince Mustafa's story speaks not only of individual tragedies, but also of systemic errors that led to the collapse of an entire civilization caused by the cage system. The cage system was established to provide short-term stability, but in the long run, it led to the weakening of the Ottoman Empire. Hundreds of princes became victims of this system. This story teaches us this: depriving humans of their freedom is never a sustainable solution. The cage system provided temporary stability but caused permanent damage. When we encounter similar systems today, we should remember the lessons of the cage system. Freedom is not just a luxury. It's a fundamental condition of being human. If you enjoy these kinds of dark history stories, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. You can write in the comments which historical topic you're curious about. Let's continue learning these painful lessons of the past together. In the next video, we'll cover one of the Vatican's darkest periods. Till then, let's remember the value of freedom and be careful not to repeat the mistakes of the past.